All right, so now we've had the promise of the covenant, and now getting in verse 10 to unfold the seal or sign of this covenant relationship, that physically identifiable element. There's a spiritual aspect which has been emphasized in the initial part of the passage. Walking blamelessly, faithfully is on the spiritual side of this. And now the covenant sign is to be revealed. God, again, worked in very concrete ways. He acted in history. We talk about in our understanding of biblical historiography that we started out from in the very first week of our sessions together. Now, physical aspect of circumcision. So he says at the beginning of verse 10, Zot beriti asher tishmeru. This is my covenant which you shall guard or you shall keep, emphasizing this faithfully guarding or keeping this relationship between me, he says, beini, and so similar language that we had earlier, u beinakem, you plural, and between your seed after you. So again, reiteration. So the same phraseology between me, between you, and between your seed that we saw earlier. Now, in the final line of this verse, himo lachem kol zakar. Imperative, nifal, circumcise for yourselves every male. Here, again, kol or kal, with singular, I often translate every. When it's plural, zakarim, all males. Here, the singular, every male, is highlighted, and they're to be circumcised. And then he further outlines how this is to take place, again, as compared to perhaps Egyptian circumcision, or he says, thus you shall circumcise the basar, introduced by it, indicator of the definite direct object, the basar arlatekim, the flesh of your foreskin. And it shall be the oat for a sign, beriti beini, ubeinekim, between, it's a sign of the covenant between me and between you. So between me and you, this is to be a sign, this indicator, verse 11, that would highlight the identifying element of Israelite covenant relationship with their God. Now, so imperative, instruction. Now, when do you do it? It is when a child is a Bain Monat Yamin, a son of 8 days. Again, remember, you use a plural year or days when you're dealing with a single digit number like Shmoneh, 8. Here in the construct, Shmonat, in the ordinal, the 8th day. Yimol, imperfect form. Lakem, Kol Zakar, every male among you will be circumcised. Ledoro Tekem, throughout, or 2 generations of you, throughout your generations. Every male be circumcised on the 8th day. You lead by it. It is a child of house. In other words, a household member, male, or and, either way you can take the vav here. U miknat kesef, bought with silver or bought with money. Mikol ben Nekar, also one who is a foreigner, a son of foreign descent. Again, as I highlighted before in the introduction, God's plan was for a covenant relationship with many nations. Your son, your descendants, your many seed after you, one who is born of your household, who is under the covenant family faith, ones that you have purchased. Again, we're dealing with the culture of that day. Various slaves that have been purchased with money, and it could include foreigners. So it's not just the direct seed of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, but God's plan in this covenant relationship was broad-based in his original plan for blessing of the nations. Then we have in verse 13 the reiteration of these, Himol Yemol. And remember, when you have an infinitive absolute preceding the finite verb, Yemol, it is for emphasis. So, indeed, you are to be circumcising children of your household, those purchased and so forth, because they are part of this covenant relationship. And so it shall be my covenant with your flesh as an eternal covenant. So Berit mentioned twice then in verse 13. So this special relationship is now being defined in a physical fashion with the male members of the household via circumcision. And as we continue on through these intermediate verses, we have repetition of the same. And a special reminder, if there is a person who does not agree to the circumcision identity, they're to be cut off from. Okay, so, you refuse circumcision, you're refusing to be identified with the family of faith. Sometimes the cutting off means extermination or execution. So you have to read, by the way, any narrative where this language is used in the biblical text. Sometimes it specifies with certain requirements where this is done by abject, outright refusal to follow God's instruction. The punishment could be meted out by execution. Other times you are simply banished. You are sent off, like in the wilderness. You'd be sent off to the outer realms, out of the presence of the family of faith in the context of the covenant community. Here also note that the use of nephesh, that here person. Nephesh here is because we're talking about circumcision, and that the refusal or rejection of this covenant relationship via circumcision, if refused, that person becomes. So it has both spiritual and physical dimensions. That nephesh is to be cut off from among this people, because of their lack of covenant relationship. So nephesh has quite an interesting range of meaning. Semantic domain is the fancy word for a range of meaning. There's sometimes when the word nephesh refers to the physical body, sometimes the spiritual dimensions of humanity. Sometimes it refers simply to a dead body in the burial practices relative to the time of ancient Israel. Contact with a dead body means what we call death contamination. It renders one impure, and you have to go through a purification ritual. So in the like in the book of Numbers, has some delineations in this regard, as well as Leviticus, where even if, for example, you're in the tent where grandfather dies, you are rendered imperfect. You haven't touched. If a vessel of flour is left open and somebody dies in your tent, that vessel of flour becomes contaminated by death, the death impurity. But one of those delineations in the book of Numbers, if you have become unclean as a result of nephesh, so it's not like nephesh mot, or mata, a dead body. It's simply nephesh. So it can refer to a dead body time. So it has quite an interesting range of meaning. It can mean life or death. Here, it is a person who has refused the circumcision identification. They were to be cut off from their national identity. Then verse 15 goes on to reiterate another part of this relationship. And the renaming of Sarah goes, of course, hand in hand. After this identifying of the male, we now move to Sarai and the shift of her name from Sarai to Sarah. Some suggest, even though we don't know the exact etymological derivation of this, it seems to fit in with Abraham being a father of many nations, through whom many kings would come, that the aspect of Sarah now is given a more honorific name, like Avram to Avraham, a heightened honor, emphasizing also the blessing of many nations, but that also through this honorable position, Sarah will have as the person through whom the covenant promise of descendant will come. And the promise, of course, that follows in this section with the birth of the son who is to be named Isaac, verse 17. So initially, Sarai, Ishtakai, Sarai, your wife, no longer will be called her name Sarai, for in fact, Sarah is understood. This is what we call a verbless clause, because Sarah, her name. And he says, I will bless her. V'gam natati v'mena l'kavisan. And in fact, indeed, I will give from her to you a son. The unbelievable. I will bring back to our theme of blessing, the child of blessing, through whom the nations would be ultimately blessed, is through this son born to the aged Abram and now Abraham, and Sarai, who is now being named Sarah, the honorable princess Sarah, will be blessed. Together they will be blessed with the birth of a son. Malkei Amin, kings of peoples from her will come forth. And Abraham did what? Again, unbelievable. He falls on his face again. And he laughed. Yitzchak. So, what does God say? All right. Sounds like a good name. And again, we are told of Sarah's age unusual. Told that soon this child would be born and the son would be brought forth. Said in his heart, Mea Shana, at 100 years going to have a son? Even with Sarah, who's a daughter of Teshaim 90 Shana, she will give birth? Really? Ah, yes. So God goes on to say, yes, Abram. As he says to God, Ishmael shall live before you. God said, of all. Yeah. So he's thinking initially that this reference to a son, he just hasn't fully gotten the picture. This blessing would accrue through Ishmael, and God says, nope, indeed. None other than, that's kind of the way I've translated of all here, none other than Sarah, your wife. She will give birth for you a son. Verse 19. Continuing, and you shall call his name Yitzhak, because you laughed. And he says, I will establish my covenant with him, an eternal covenant through his seed after him. So now we have the unfolding of the plan from Abraham through Sarah, through the generations that would come forth through this promised son, Isaac. God comes back again in verse 20 and highlights that God will bless, as he has promised earlier in Genesis, to fulfill his promise to Hagar in Ishmael. He says that he would bless him and bring forth many nations as well. And so we're told then later in this passage about the age of Ishmael. At age 13, he would be circumcised. He's listed in the first text, I would imagine Abraham would have to do Ishmael before he circumcised himself, or if he had somebody else do it. But we're reminded as the chapter began with the 99 years that the age of Abraham, now Abraham, the full name, the son of Teshaim v'Tesha Shana, of 99 years, when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Ishmael, his son, was 13 when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. So a lot of repetition. So by now, when you finish the translation of this material, the various forms of mol, hemol, nimol, the verb for circumcision in the Old Testament Hebrew. So, hope you have a good week as you work through your material in this amazing chapter with a covenant sign and a promise of a deliberate, promised heirship through Isaac, the child born to the aged, amazed, though seemingly laughable to Abram, later to Sarah, Isaac, the child whose name was Laughter. One of my favorite old Michael Card songs. They called him Laughter. Have a great week.